All right, Brian, let's get going. Hello, everybody.
All right.
I just want to say welcome to the Office of Research with Relevance Friday Features. This is our second to last Friday Features for the semester. And if you haven't heard me talk about it yet, we've got wonderful things in store for us for Research with Relevance in the fall. We're going to have a Dean's Showcase, and we're also going to do it live. Simulcast on Teams. We're coming up with something really fun with receptions every time, with wine and beer following each show. I don't know, something. It's going to be fantastic. So last time we met, which was 2 weeks ago, we had Professor Brian Moore, who discussed with us how to better understand the impact that traumatic stressors have on military members and their families. It was a great show. I think we made some good research connections across campus, which, as you all know, is one of the primary reasons why we're doing this. If you haven't met me yet, my name is Phaedra Corso. I'm your host for today. I'm the Vice President for Research. I feel honored to be in this position. It's really the best part of my week. We've had a fantastic week in research at KSU this week. Are you ready for this? We have brought in $1.5 million in NIH funding this week alone. Woo! And that's not even counting what Brian's going to be bringing us coming up in a couple of months. So we're doing really, really well. And, just a big congratulations and thank you to our research staff, not just in my unit, but across the colleges. And then, of course, to our faculty who just work tirelessly to bring in research at the same time that you're doing other really important things like mentoring students and teaching students and all the wonderful things that you do. So a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Oh, by the way, I haven't had lunch today and I'm sucking down a Coke Zero. So if I'm talking a little bit fast, please understand, we're good. Okay, so a few housekeeping tips. First, please make sure your mics are muted and I can see that everybody has done that. So thank you very much. You can unmute at the end when we do a Q&A session. Let's see, if you want to highlight our speaker today, you can highlight Brian's name. There's a little 3 dots next to him and his face will be blown up on your screen. And then finally, this episode, as all Research with Relevance episodes, are recorded and we put this on our YouTube page either tonight or over the weekend so that you can watch this show over and over and over again. That would be wonderful. Okay, so our schedule for the next hour is we are going to watch a video that's giving an overview of the work of our featured faculty member. And today we are featuring Brian Kliszczewicz. Brian Kliszczewicz. Then we're going to do a live interview with Brian. I have very little prepared script. So Scott Gordon, I see you're on the call and I'm going to look forward to you coming in and saving me when I start to stutter. So that will be great. So I'll start off the questions. If you want to ask a question through participants through the chat, please feel free to do that or raise your hand or just interrupt us. That will all be fine. Let me start with an introduction of Brian Kliszczewicz. He is from the Wellstar College of Health and Human Services. And Brian joined, Brian, you're an old timer now. You joined the KSU faculty in 2013.
That's right.
That's wonderful. And he is currently an associate professor of exercise science in the Department of Exercise Science and Sports Management. He has served as the coordinator for KSU's exercise science biomarker lab since 2015. He earned a PhD in exercise physiology from Auburn University, and he is a member of the American College of Sports Medicine. He received a fellowship from that organization in 2018. And I think one of my first visits to Perelman Hall was I met with the dean at the time. And then I said, hey, I'd like to meet some of the faculty. And he brought me to your lab. And I just was so impressed with you and your students and the work that you're doing in the lab. And so I'm just honored that you're here with us today. Go ahead and mute. I'm going to mute myself. Brian, you do the same. And Heather's going to play the video for us.
My name is Brian Kliszczewicz, and I'm an associate professor of exercise science in the Wellstar College of Health and Human Services. I originally became interested in exercise science when I was an undergraduate student playing lacrosse at Mercyhurst University. and I enrolled in the sports medicine program with a concentration in health fitness promotion. And through this experience, I was exposed to a unique blend of exercise prescription, physical therapy, and injury management. Then I was fortunate enough to get accepted into the University of Florida's Master's Program of Health and Human Performance. It was there that I became exposed to the world of research. I was trained in benchtop techniques and observed and trained in several research labs, including skeletal muscle atrophy, oxidative stress, and nitric oxide. The lab training and personal connections that I made eventually led me to my doctoral program at Auburn University. At Auburn University, I studied under Dr. John Quindry in the Cardiac Protection Lab, where I further developed my benchtop research skills. Additionally, I was working with another faculty member at Auburn University at Montgomery with Dr. Michael Esco, where I was exposed to cardiac autonomic stress through the measure of heart rate variability, or HRV. Together, these two metrics provided me with a way to examine physiological stress via biomarkers and non-invasive measure of autonomic nervous system regulation. During my last year at Auburn, I was heavily involved in CrossFit training. And interestingly, many people in the exercise science community were apprehensive of this modality, despite the level of participant interest and retention. Was this modality as dangerous as some may have suspected? Well, this led to my dissertation project examining a commonly performed bout of CrossFit and comparing these markers of stress to that of an intensity-matched running bout. Briefly, when evaluating biomarkers of oxidative stress, we found no differences. When looking at cardiac autonomic stress, we see an increased amount of acute stress experience in the CrossFit group, but both returned to baseline at the same time, suggesting limited difference in the experienced stress. With the popularity of the CrossFit modality in the general population, I began to shift my focus towards the application of this exercise to sedentary and at-risk populations. And chief among these populations are those with type 2 diabetes. This is a progressive disease that is a critical public health concern in industrialized nations. More than 34 million adults are living with diabetes in the United States. And the most pragmatic approach to prevent or slow the progression of type 2 diabetes is through physical activity or exercise interventions. However, before I approach this problem, I wanted to gain a better understanding of the dose response and the accrued stress of various bouts. And so we examined two different CrossFit style workouts, one 15-minute circuit and the other a sub 5-minute bout, to see if there were any differences in adaptive markers or potential differences in physiological stress. What we saw when looking at the results of cardiac autonomic strain or autonomic nervous system recovery, we see what looks to be superimposed figures suggesting that there was virtually no difference in the depression or the rate of recovery in autonomic nervous system markers or biomarkers. When looking at various markers of growth and inflammation, we saw a similar response in that no real significant differences were observed outside of growth hormone, which is more of a metabolic stress indicator. Lastly, we see that blood glucose regulations react similarly. And so what we learned from this is that a sub 5-minute bout of exercise is stressful enough to elicit similar acute physiological responses to that of the longer 15-minute bout, and expressing no differences in physiological stress. How can we use this information? Seeing little difference in physiological stress and similar acute adaptive responses in healthy recreational men with the sub 5-minute bout, we set out to create a very low time commitment 12-week body weight circuit training program for people with type 2 diabetes. This program started with an initial 5-minute bout 3 days a week and progressed to 8-minute bouts 4 days a week. The bout consisted of 10 modified bodyweight squats, 5 modified push-ups, 5 modified pull-ups, and 10 crunches. The study was short-lived because we saw a fundamental flaw. After 3 participants had completed the exercise program, we saw positive changes in strength, aerobic capacity, and fasting blood glucose. However, HbA1c, a diagnostic marker of diabetes, did not change. The program was not long enough of a duration to elicit a response. So we revamped the program and changed the intervention to be 16 weeks and had the sessions performed at home. Prior to funding running out, we were able to get 8 individuals into the study, with 2 dropping out for personal reasons and 1 with too high of insulin levels. The 5 who completed the program demonstrated very promising changes. These findings served as the pilot feasibility data for a grant proposal submitted to the National Institute of Health, which hopefully will be funded. Between 2012 and 2017, the financial cost of this disease increased by 26%, with an average financial burden of roughly $9,600 per patient each year. As of 2017, the overall direct and indirect cost of this disease was estimated to be $327 billion in the United States. Finding pragmatic, cost-effective countermeasures to slow the progression and treat diabetes is not enough. Providing additional programs that are both time-efficient and appealing is urgently needed. We believe our intervention will be a successful tool in fighting the progression of type 2 diabetes. Our next step is to examine recently diagnosed patients with type 2 diabetes and apply our intervention in order to slow the progression, if not reverse it. If this becomes successful, we can then move to examine those with more advanced forms of type 2 diabetes, and from there the world opens up to us. And one final note, I would like to take a moment to recognize the student researchers who have made my research possible over the years here at KSU. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some incredible students. Thank you all.
That's great. I love that, Brian, and I love that you ended on such a positive note with your students. So let's start there. Do you primarily work with undergrads, graduate students? Do they come from all different fields? Tell me a little bit about them.
Well, it started off with undergraduate students when I was in my earlier stages with research, and I got very, very fortunate with a handful of them, specifically Cassie Williamson and Emily Betschke. There were two that were on the end of the presentation there, and they ended up, I started with them as they were juniors as undergrad, and they decided to stay through their entire master's. So I actually got to work with them very closely for those 4.5 years, and they're actually now on seeking to get their PhDs at different institutions. So very proud of them. Afterwards, during that time, it was a lot of graduate student research, and what I ended up, and very fortunately, mind you, I got a little bit distracted from my primary research aim for about a year or 2 years because I was learning to mentor graduate students, and they had these wildly different ideas that I never would have thought of, and it kind of put me outside of my comfort zone. So I ended up having to weave some of what I was capable of doing to match some of their interests. And I really can't thank them enough for kind of giving me that nudge, because I really think it helped me where I got to today.
Yeah,
and
that's great.
Unfortunately, with COVID and having to kind of put things on pause, everyone's since really graduated. And so I'm going to be starting off with a clean slate, but our department is in no short of just eager students to get into the lab. So I'm very excited to get started back up soon.
That's great. So let's switch over to your research for a second. So I think you give such a good example of, as researchers, we don't know the answers in advance, and that's why we do pilot work, and that's why we make adjustments or pivots, and also, the field that you're in made a pivot, perhaps away from CrossFit. And so will you tell us a little bit about that, kind of the field of CrossFit, but then also what you learned that allowed you to pivot to where you are now in your research?
Yeah, I think I'll start off with the modality first and why I initially got interested in it. At the time, once CrossFit kind of went from this very obscure, it seemed to be almost a niche workout where it seemed to be only focused for military, firefighter, police, and it started to bleed out to former athletes who no longer were playing sports, and then to general population. And it had such a great group environment and atmosphere that people were just highly engaged, and to a point where we've never really seen it before. And I'll admit, being a former athlete, it's what attracted me to it. And I was just very heavily involved. And at that point, it started to catch a little bit of attention, and both positive and negative. And that's where, when at the time at Auburn University, I kept hearing a lot of concerns from those who were in the strength conditioning field because of perhaps the training of the the level of training that the trainers may have, the way that the exercises were being prescribed, but the general consensus was they didn't care for it too much. And I was thinking, people they don't want to stop. Like they're getting upset if they can't come in for a day. They don't want to participate in research if it requires a 24-hour period of rest. And for this entire time thinking that we can't get people engaged, and our biggest issue is getting people involved in regular physical activity, and our biggest concern is they're too involved and too invested. I thought there was a little bit of dissonance there, and that's kind of what got me interested in wanting to do the research.
But so help me understand, what was the criticism of CrossFit? Was it that it was causing too many injuries? It was being led by people who aren't trained? It wasn't providing positive results in terms of physiology? Like what was the criticism, or is the criticism?
I think it was a blend of personalities. The individual who was the head of CrossFit certainly did not make a lot of friends, that being one of them. The other part is one of the main principles is trying to get complete as much work in a short period of time, which is not necessarily a concept that fosters good technique. And in situations where you may have a trainer who is not very well trained and that is trying to encourage people to go too fast, there is an increased likelihood for somebody to get injured. And I think that was an initial critique. I think now, I know Dr. Fado has done some research on injury prevalence, and really it doesn't really supersede any other sport from what at least he has ascertained. I think the biggest issue when it came to our field was there was a conflict with a study that was published a little while back, and I'll refrain from naming any of the names or any institutions that were involved, but there was purported data that was released that should not have been released, or may have been inferred that shouldn't have been inferred, and it caused some lawsuits between the two. And because of that, there was about a 2-year period where publishing was very, very difficult anywhere. And so we had to remove the CrossFit modality. So you see HIFT out there, so high intensity functional training, as kind of a synonym for it. And at that point, I think I decided, and that kind of influenced me, as I really like this modality. I see its potential in being able to maybe carry this over to populations who really don't like exercise, and getting them more engaged than what they have been in the past. And considering the environment with publications and making it so difficult, it kind of nudged me to go in that direction a little bit sooner than maybe I had anticipated. But I couldn't be happier that things turn out the way they did.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I think this is a story that we've heard before. People who were interested in gun violence, the federal government no longer provides funding in that area, so they have to pivot a little bit. People, maybe NIH is trying to stay away from that CrossFit term, so you change it to a different term. So thank you for giving us that illustration. Scott, jump on in and ask a question.
Well, you told me to, so I'm doing it. But anyway, I would have anyway. But I figured I'd give you a chance to take a drink of Diet Coke while I ask a question. So Brian, congratulations. And I'll just mention, obviously we're proud of the work you're doing. And for those on the call, I have some background in a little bit of the area that Brian is coming from as well. So I'll say that he did, as Phaedra alluded to, just get a very excellent score on an NIH R15, very excellent. And it historically is very hard because there is a bias in NIH study sections. I've sat there and listened to it against exercise, especially things like high intensity training or strength training. So great job selling and marketing and showing the relevance of your research to be able to get that score, Brian. So I'm going to throw that in there first before I ask my question. just to give some people some context. So I think it speaks highly of what you've done. You were presenting your data. It went pretty quickly in the video. When you had to pivot to go to the at-home training, as you've already mentioned, I think one of the most important things about any type of exercise program is not so much exactly what you're doing, but the fact that you just keep doing it. You know, that the adherence to any exercise program is the most vital component of it. Did you compare the effectiveness of your training to any other home training programs, or was it just the one program, like a pre-post longitudinal?
It was just a pre-post longitudinal. In the grant that we have just got scored, we will be comparing it to the ADA's traditional 150-minute aerobic training. And so we're going to go ahead and based on the literature review for what we saw with our very small pilot study, but when we looked at the averages, the 16-week study that we had matched almost across the board any other intervention that was either 16 weeks to 6 months. And so that was part of the appeal. And actually, I want to backtrack just for a second, and I want to thank you very much for the extremely kind words on the grant. And I also want to thank you all, Phaedra, Scott, you were also very much so involved. These kind of helped me out early on with all this. The OVPR's office, the exercise science department as a whole, you guys were pivotal in helping me get along this. We had these summer fellows that I was involved with. So that grant would not have happened or been as well received if it wasn't for the level of support that I was given. So I just want to say thank you with that.
Aw. Thank you. Thank you for being a marketer for our office. I appreciate it.
And one more thing I wanted to add with the intervention, I didn't have time in the video to say it, and I think the reason why this was so appealing, and to Scott's point of making sure that these exercises are something that, or these interventions are something that people are going to stick with, it started off as a 15-minute a week time requirement. So it was 3 5-minute sessions. And as time went on, after the 4th week, you would start to add a minute to it, and you capped it off at 10-minute sessions. And in the 10th week, we allowed them to add a 4th day. And so eventually it started off just with a 5 and ended with 40 minutes total time requirements, which is still less than 1/3 of what the traditional starting point of most other programs. And for individuals who really aren't comfortable with engaging in exercise or don't really necessarily want to, just don't like exercise, I think it's more palatable to start off with this 15-minute bout. And then I'm hoping I'm kind of being clever about this, and this is kind of a nice way to introduce them to eventually starting programs that are a little bit more robust afterwards. So this isn't really necessarily a cure-all. I think this, in my mind, I've always envisioned this being a very nice on-ramp program to something more and to something a little bit larger.
So you know, how do you market this to a general population? I know that your focus on this particular grant proposal was a diabetes population, and we understand that you have to hone in on a specific disease if you want to get funding from NIH. But the applications for a general population are incredible. I mean, for someone like myself who has zero time to do anything, this is a very appealing intervention, as you're starting to prove that it's effective. But can you imagine this type of intervention where I could just have an app? You know, I'm getting inundated with how to do yoga 5 minutes a day on an app, right? So is this something that you can envision could be app-based without a professional trainer, or it could somehow be tailored to my body type and my physiology, maybe in the beginning with a professional trainer, but then it allows me to keep going through without having to go into a gym and meet with someone? I guess I'm just trying to think about, generalizability and implementation to the real world.
I'm actually very glad you brought that up. It absolutely does have the potential to be an at-home app. There's actually one of the things when I was fancying myself a competitor for CrossFit, and I was doing some training. There's actually video apps that can look at your form and evaluate form to make sure you're doing proper technique, prevent injury, which is something that could be kind of dovetailed into an at-home app on this. But one thing that I've realized between the first initial pilot and the second pilot was recruitment being such an issue. And that kind of leads to what my thought is on marketing. I think we are inundated and saturated in the exercise field with these 5-minute cure-alls, and here's this app, lose 20 pounds in a month kind of shtick. And I don't necessarily think that would be a successful direction to go with it. And the reason I say this is when we were doing our recruiting, and this is by pure happenstance, which so far up to this point, so much of this has just been very fortunate timing and meeting the right people. Went to my physicians for the annual checkup, was asking what it is I did over at Kennesaw, and I let him know the pilot study that we were doing. And he says, you know what, I'll be right back. And he came back, he gave me his card, and then walked me up front, and he wanted me to meet with the nursing staff, and they said that, listen, give all your information here, let us know exactly what the study is, and we're going to send people who meet the criteria for your study to you. And from that point on, funding started to get a little bit low. We're getting towards the tail end, but my phone was inundated with phone calls for requesting the study. And the most commonly asked question that I received was, how much do we have to pay to participate in your study? That blew my mind. It blew my mind. And so I guess making a long story long.
We're desperate. I think this whole idea in health promotion that people don't understand what it takes to have a healthy body. I think we do understand. We just don't have the time, or we don't have the money, or we don't have the expert next to us to help us, do things correctly.
And so I think that the answer to the question then is not necessarily, I don't think anyone is going to be very trusting of marketing. I think, sorry, I air quoted down before. So I think it's going to be, collaborating with the medical field and getting those references and referrals. I mean, there was one study that I looked at that for recently diagnosed diabetics, only 3% of them were provided an actual organized exercise program. Out of, I think I might be wrong, but it was several thousand participants or patients that recently diagnosed just weren't receiving any real tangible information. And so I think that's where we could still have it an app, or maybe we can have it an app with an insurance company. But I think as long as we have MDs that are on board that are prescribing it, I think that's going to be more of the, I think that's where we're going to see the response that's going to be more meaningful.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's kind of the integration of clinical with public health.
Yes.
They should never be functioning separately, right? Mark's got his hand up, but before we get to you, Mark, I'm going to go to a couple of questions that are in the chat. So just hold on for 1 second. You've got someone who wants to sign up for your at-home program. If you want to recruit right here today, you're going to be able to get a few people who want to be engaged in your program. So that's good. The next question is, for resistance training, depending on chronological and even biological age, equivalent different lengths of recovery periods are needed. HRV is now commonly used to determine if adequate recovery has been achieved. Any thought of using this or some other paradigm to adjust recovery period, or are all your patients have a uniform age and condition? It's a great question, but
that is a fantastic question.
Yeah,
that is a very, very, very good question. And to be honest, it looks like you're stealing some of the thunder for future research. I do quite a bit of HRV research, and a couple of avenues that I wanted to go with HRV and just overall glucose metabolism. Actually, not. Let let me just answer the question first. I think there absolutely is a future using resting HRV measures to gauge recovery. I also think there's a future of kind of being able to use HRV just to look at overall fluctuations and change in glucose regulation. And so that's a kind of a side interest that I have in all of this. But I think first, before we get to that point, we need to see outside of the small pilot how effective this intervention really will be and compare that to the traditional interventions. One of the unique things is we're very fortunate enough that Fitbit is willing to work with us on this study. And they're giving us, so we have little trackers here. It's one of the things we're going to use to help for recruitment, but we're also going to get backdoor information that's going to allow us to see all the day-to-day information, including heart rate variability, which is not a normal marker that they add. So any of the sleep information you see on this is actually using heart rate variability to determine it. They just don't express it as such. So I asked if we can get that expression. So very long story short, I would like to be able to use some of that to put some feasibility together to see what some of their performances look like based on days of their resting HRV.
Good. So Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, just wanted to mention how proud we are of Brian. And one of the thing that's nice, you mentioned the screening of workouts via apps and that kind of thing. And that's actually one of the sub projects in an iCubed grant that was funded through the research office and involves our department as well. So working with the folks in computer science and engineering to develop video-based technique protocols that are based on some crazy machine learning stuff. So that's another nice little plug for the Office of Research. I wanted to ask you, Brian, you've spoken about this a lot, but the American College of Sports Medicine has a program name and kind of a mantra called Exercise is Medicine. And not to disparage pharmacological interventions in a population like type 2 diabetes, but could you speak generally about how exercise can be effective medicine in populations like this, and what sort of subtleties might be involved? And I'll just add one more thing. There was a study in which exercise was suggested to patients, and there was very little adherence to it. But in another subgroup, exercise was actually prescribed by the physicians. They wrote out the script on a piece of paper, and those patients did it because they got the same thing that would be their medicine was an exercise protocol, and they adhered to it. So I'm not asking a specific question, but if you could talk a little bit about the medicinal roles of exercise, particularly in the groups you're working with.
Sure. And yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. It's partially loaded, and so I'm going to try to be as respectful as possible when answering.
Put on your diplomatic hat, right?
I'm putting on the diplomatic hat. And one of the reasons why exercise is considered medicine, and let's use type 2 diabetes or just glucose regulation as an example, since we're on the topic. And one of the major goals of, let's say, glucose regulating medication is to either increase insulin sensitivity, increase insulin production, or to decrease hepatic output of glucose. And we do so pharmacologically, which we're now finding out. I think recently we just heard that metformin has some potential carcinogens, so they're going to try to revamp the medication. But diplomatic hat, when you do any type of physical activity, skeletal muscle contraction is a very wonderful way to increase glucose uptake. So we're going to increase in the short term acutely insulin sensitivity. We're going to pull in glucose, help regulate it, and we're going to reduce the need for hepatic output of glucose. And in case you guys are familiar with hepatic output, so liver stored glycogen and we try to increase blood glucose, even though we already have higher levels. And it does so because the body doesn't necessarily understand that we have this high blood glucose levels. We just know that the tissue is not receiving it. So obviously we must have low blood glucose. So by contracting skeletal muscle, or just by moving, exercise, this physical activity, we are going to reduce, we're going to maintain a healthy level of blood glucose. And long term, the effect is we're starting to see insulin sensitivity increase on a more consistent basis, which means we don't need to produce as much insulin. And the reason why diabetes is such a could become such a problematic disease for a number of reasons, but as we have chronically elevated blood glucose, we are also going to have chronically elevated insulin. So further decreasing insulin sensitivity, but then adding strain to the pancreas. So by just simply adding steps into the day, by doing small levels of activity, we are going to see the improvements of that environment, less dependent on insulin pathways, more dependent on skeletal muscle contraction. And it does that without having to pay several $100s a month on medications. And my view on most medications is that you're taking a shotgun and you're hitting several things, but you're targeting, you have a target of one thing, but you happen to be hitting several other things. You're never just doing one thing when you're taking medication.
Okay, you're giving me a guilt trip, so let's move on. Scott, you have your hand raised. Is that from before, or do you have another question?
No, this is another question. And actually what Mark asked and what you just talked about was perfect lead into what I was going to say. And I always refer to exercise as a magic bullet. So Brian, a little bit of this is me preaching, and then I do have questions for you, Brian. But the exercise, virtually everything you do, unless you do it wrongly, with exercise is positively beneficial for almost every organ system in the entire body. A drug may target one thing, but may be detrimental to every other system that it's not targeting. So that's what's great thing about exercise is medicine. I have a couple related questions to you. There are things like with blood pressure and a little bit, at least some of the previous literature with diabetes, some of the exercise programs are more effective with worse conditions, like for mild hypertension or perhaps pre-diabetes. Exercise programs might not be as effective, even though they're still important. So my first question will be, have you tried with pre-diabetic patients yet? And secondly, did you see any weight loss with your programs, and was there any correlation with the weight loss component? Because we do know the higher percent body fat is associated with more insulin resistance.
Can I add to that before you answer, Brian? So not just pre-diabetic, but with this new research you're doing, will you have the ability with your sample size to look at gender and age differences?
Okay. So I'm going to try to answer this in almost reverse order. So Scott, with the question involving weight loss or body composition, I think that's going to be more accurate in this case. We actually saw a weight gain over the 16-week period. A little bit of gain in body fat, but there was a 2 kilogram increase in muscle mass during this time. And to me, that is far more important and meaningful than what's happening with body fat at that particular point. To me, I think that's something you tackle on a little bit later. Muscle mass is such an important aspect for resting metabolic rate and just overall consistent glucose regulation. So to me, that's a bigger get than losing a pound or two in adipose tissue. And at the end of the day, looking upon it, I was a little bit disappointed at first when I first saw the data, and then realizing, I think this is a better win than what I was initially looking at. As far as correlations, we had such a small group. I think I would be irresponsible to say there's any correlations at this point with such a small group. With the R15, in terms of trying to see if there'll be any age or gender sex differences. I think we're going to have a total of 41 participants per group. So I think we might start to get a picture painted for us. I wouldn't be very confident in that numbers to be able to run any meaningful correlations, but I think that would, with supplement grants, I think we can actually add more participants that will allow us to examine that, and that would be one of the goals that I would have with the R15. And I think there was one more question that was asked, and what was it, Scott?
Let's see, I think, did you answer Phaedra's question about age and gender?
Yes, so it's the pre-diabetes population.
Okay, so
right.
I think the outside of being so have such a chronic condition that would prevent you from participating in exercise, the further along you are, the more gains you have to make. And so what I would imagine is the healthier you are, the less gains. I think I'm trying to paraphrase what you were saying before. So yeah, we may see less as we get to healthier populations, but would I imagine this be a benefit for those who are pre-diabetics? If they're, I don't know at this point. I think it would be a great intervention to use just for the simple aspect it gets them moving, and it's that on-ramp to something better. Yeah, I think that's the best I can say. But when it comes to future projects with this, that's one thing I'd like to, that's absolutely one thing I'd like to do. We have the ability, we have a very unique position with this particular grant. We are looking at type 2 diabetics that are recently diagnosed that are not taking any medications. So we can for sure say that any responses we see are based on the interventions and not based on the effects of the medications. One individual in our particular study, or one of the cutoff points that we put in the pilots, was that they could not be insulin dependent, because of the whole purpose of this intervention was to recruit as much skeletal muscle as possible and to influence insulin sensitivity. So that'd be too much of an issue. But if we get this precursor with type 2 diabetics not on medications, we now can go upwards to those who are a little further along, require medications. What does this do in this population? And on the same note, go one step down to pre-diabetics or just obese and sedentary or at risk, and we can see how this intervention does. And the one thing that's not in this particular one that I would like to add in the future is 6-month follow-ups, and to see what is adherence like after we're not here watching them and we're not keeping track. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest takeaways from the study is are we reaching them when we're not there?
I'll just add, Brian, to the importance of your research that obviously you're going with people who have been recently diagnosed as diabetic, which of course is an important first population, and it's easily translatable, even if you don't study it, to say that people with pre-diabetes, this would be important for them, because you have this window of pre-diabetes to progression to diabetes where it's really important to prevent that progression, because once you get into a diabetic state, it's a lot harder to regulate. So so I wasn't asking to diminish the importance of what you're doing. I think that it's just it's really vital for anyone, even without diabetes, right? Because it can keep you from progressing.
And if you're solely going to be dependent on pharmacological interventions, you're only slowing it down. At that point, you're on a boat, you're just scooping the water out, and you're just trying to buy time. And if you're not making the lifestyle changes, chances are what led to the condition is probably continuing, and you're just slowing it down until eventually you just require more medication.
And let me just add on process. When you and I talked earlier this week, you said that you have to get the grant first, and that's going to happen any day now. And then there's what happens next. And you and I had talked about a supplement, a diversity supplement. I think you and I mentioned that. But I actually see something different, which is if you right now, if this RF15 is going to fund you only up until a certain point, and you're thinking that it would be nice to have longer term outcomes, that's a grant that you could submit, within the first 6 months of launching this grant, or within the first year. So just know that you really are in such a sweet space right now to build and build and build. So I'm excited to see you at the beginning of this NIH funding career that you're about to launch into.
Thank you. I'm ecstatic. I couldn't be happier right now. And it's such a wonderful position to be in. And I'm very fortunate to be, I also work with Dr. Ingram on her gestational diabetes grant. And we were just recently discussing how wonderful it would be as we start having some data coming in, and we're seeing some of the, hopefully some positive benefits with this intervention, and getting some more understanding from her study to possibly merge these two as an R1 in the future. And that's something we're very excited about. It's just right now in the exercise science department, we couldn't be in a better position, I don't think.
I fully agree. And your dean is here to ask you a question, and I bet she would agree with me too.
Thank you, Phaedra. Actually, I don't have a question. I think the conversation has been so phenomenal. I'm so sorry, I'm sitting in the dark. The sun was hitting me, and apparently now it looks like I'm in a cave. But congratulations, Brian. This is just phenomenal to learn more about your work and hearing about it. But of course, I'm loving Phaedra's word about, your research having hit the sweet spot, and we're going to build and build and build. So I know some of the ideas have already been raised, but can you help us articulate your vision? What do you think, again, Phaedra sort of outline a way maybe you can do an R1 or something like that for a longer time type study, but can we think outside the box for sort of a minute and just what other sort of areas can you embrace or include in this, or other populations? Just think big for a moment. We'd just love to hear your thoughts, since we're in this great space together. And again, congratulations on all the fantastic work. We're very excited for you and with you. Thank you.
And it's wonderful finally getting to meet you. I haven't had a chance to actually see you kind of in person, but now I actually get to visually see you. So, and welcome to KSU. Well, one of the big things in terms of thinking outside the box, I kind of mentioned it, but working with Katie for the R1, to me, I'm actually very excited about the prospect of using this very simple 15-minute to 40-minute a week technique to hopefully prevent gestational diabetes. I think that would be a fantastic utilization of this. Outside of that, I think some of the next, if we're really thinking big, we're thinking a couple years down the road, and we see that this is in fact something that's successful. One of the personal issues I have with it now is that it's consistent movements throughout. And I think the next thing is presenting them almost a Lego style program. You give them this overall structure for the first 16 weeks, and then you kind of let them start to decide they don't want to do these assisted squats. They want to graduate. They want to try something else. Give them options. And eventually you can start to allow them to know what movements they might like, what movements they're comfortable with, or change things up a little bit so it doesn't become stale, it doesn't become boring. And now we took something that was very simple on ramp, and they start to develop their own understanding of exercise techniques, of exercise distribution. And that's one of the biggest issues that I think is out there. You can tell someone to exercise and they have no idea. I mean, you can tell me I need to change the carburetor in the car. I don't know how to do that. You can go ahead and tell me how to litigate something. You can tell me that I need to do something with my taxes. I don't know. I'm not trained that way. And the same thing goes for exercise, but it's such a strange thing that everyone's expected to just know what to do. Here's your gym membership, have fun, don't let the weights hit you. And so I would like for this to be something that eventually evolves into not only something that can help combat these chronic conditions, but that can encourage people to be more long-term with their adherence to exercise and give them a better understanding of it. That would be in my perfect world if things worked out the way they could work out. That's something I would like to see.
No, that makes perfect sense. Great answer. Thank you.
It looks like maybe this is a question, but probably also a comment about, have you considered looking into polycystic ovary syndrome? This population of women commonly has insulin resistant issues. Currently, there's no cure. Metformin is often prescribed to manage these symptoms, and it follows the thread that Scott mentioned about a pre-diabetic option.
I would be absolutely open to that. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna want to save that comment, and I think Dr. Ingram and I may want to sit down and discuss that. Thank you. I personally am not very familiar with it. Gestational diabetes is something that, again, I've probably been one of the most fortunate individuals at KSU. Every major opportunity just kind of appears. Dr. Ingram came to me one day, asked me to do some blood work for her pilot data for this, and all of a sudden now I'm on an R15 with her, and I'm now beginning to learn about gestational diabetes. You would ask me a year ago, I've had no idea. So I apologize, I can't be more specific on that condition, but I think that's something that is absolutely worthwhile investigating.
Yeah, good. Luck doesn't happen. Luck is generated by your positive energy and your willingness to work with others. So good for you. All right. So, I ask questions, in general questions, to faculty who have participated in this show. How did you get to KSU? Why are you here? How can we keep you here? You came from Auburn, which is an R1. You studied in R1. You landed here. So I have been interviewing lots of faculty who have been applying for positions in the last couple of weeks. I've been really heavily engaged in that, and I'm always curious to know, why did you come to KSU, and what's keeping you here?
Okay, so when I was at Auburn, I was kind of finishing up my dissertation. I was starting off with the dissertation, and one of my mentors, I mentioned Mike Esco over at Auburn Montgomery at the time, he was asking, well, what are you planning on doing after this? And I'm kind of applying to some schools. And he goes, what about Kennesaw? That's right down the road. It's a great place. I grew up there. You really need to. It's a growing university. And so I decided to take a look, and my heart sank when I saw that the position that was open, they closed it. And I actually reached out to John McLuster, who was the chair, and I asked, look, I know this just closed last week, but is it okay if I can put my application in? And clearly that worked out. And so that was one of my positive memories on that. So it was really, again, having a fortunate mentor, a mentor that was fortunate enough to, or I was fortunate enough, sorry, to have a mentor to kind of point me in that direction. And why am I staying here? Why do I want to be here? Have you guys been to our labs?
Yeah, they're pretty nice.
We have some of the best outfitted labs in the country. When I was at Auburn, prior to their brand new kinesiology building, which I did not get grandfather claused into, I was left in the Coliseum when everybody moved over to this brand new state-of-the-art building. And to give you an idea, the Coliseum was built in, I think, the 1950s. And it was every now and then we had to leave the lab because they were drilling into the tile and asbestos was there. So it was a very they made do with every piece of equipment they had. So seeing what we are given here, it is such an incredible support for the research that we are doing. Another aspect of KSU that I love right now, I love the fact that we are in R2 status. I love the support. I mean, there was one point where I was considering, well, maybe if I want to be able to do grants, if I want to be in an environment where I can actually start to be competitive in this, just learn, not even be competitive, but just to learn and to advance, I might need to look elsewhere. And fortunately, you come along and we have this new fellowship program, and we're getting a level of support that I can't imagine is really being offered anywhere else. And and a sappy note with the exercise science department right now. I mean, our environment, it's fantastic. I love coming to work every single day. We have such a good environment. There's no reason to leave.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Because we're counting on you, Brian, to serve as a mentor for the new faculty that are coming behind you. Between you and Katie and Mark and many of the others that are in your group, you all are going to be able to recruit some talent that can just keep the work you're doing going. So that's wonderful. We're just about out of time. We can open it up to one more question, but we don't have to. Is there anything, Brian, that you wanted to say that we didn't get a chance to ask you? We've kind of been all over the place and didn't follow a script at all. So I can't remember if there was anything that we wanted to cover.
Well, usually when it's mostly off script means conversation was good. So I'm pretty happy with that.
That's how I feel too. That's how I feel. Well, go ahead.
I mean, the only thing that I have, I mean, I said thank you a couple times, but no, I mean, this was such a huge honor. I am humbled for just for being asked to be here today. I'm humbled for everybody just to come and participate. I really appreciate the questions and some potential research suggestions. And I'm just looking forward what happens next. To be honest, personally, I'd like to eventually see us get knocked out of an R15 status. I'd like to, years down the road, be able to kind of look back and see, at least be part of that.
Well, that's going to come sooner rather than later. The R15 status is under a certain threshold for NIH funding, and we're becoming so successful that at some point we are going to be competing with the big dogs, and that's okay. I think we're poised in many of our areas. So yeah, I look forward to that day too. So, all right. Well, thank you, Brian. I'd like to say thank you to my staff as usual for all of the help and assistance in pulling together the videos and for coordinating everything. It's kind of duties that aren't assigned to us that we do happily because we really enjoy the show. The next show, which is the last one for the season, as I mentioned in the beginning, is on April 16th. So please mark your calendars. We'll be featuring Sylvia Bhattacharya, who is an assistant professor of electrical engineering technology in the Southern Polytech College. We're super excited to have Sylvia on. We love our women in science, and to have a woman engineer is just absolutely fantastic, and she's doing some really great work. She will be discussing, talk about a timely topic, driver-passenger behavior in autonomous vehicles, which is I think it's even part of the potential infrastructure legislation that's going to be coming through the Biden administration. So it'll be very interesting to talk to Sylvia. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the show and just say thank you to everybody for participating. And from the Office of Research, we hope you all have a healthy, happy, and safe weekend. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.